Hello everybody, my name's Andrew Jeavons. Thanks for taking the time to attend the webinar today. When we talk about quantitative semiotics, we're not talking about replacing semioticians with some sort of computer program. Really, this is about expanding the role of semiotics and leveraging some of the more recent developments in machine learning and what is generally termed artificial intelligence, and using that to expand the role of semioticians and semiotics within research. This is really about enabling semioticians in the same way that statisticians use all sorts of computer programs and statistical techniques to do their job. We think there is a role, albeit small at the moment, but a role for using computer software to empower and enable semioticians to process more data in more depth. We have to apologise for the attack of alliteration in coming up with this title. In terms of hero, well, neither my business partner Andy Dexter and I see ourselves as any sorts of heroes, and this talk represents both our thoughts on this subject. As to being heretical, I think it's fair to say that some people would think that it's heretical to use computer software in semiotics. It's traditionally, as I'll mention later, what I would term a practitioner analytical methodology. That is, it tends to be very much centered around the individual semiotician providing their interpretation of information. What we really think is that certain sorts of computer analytical techniques, particularly, as I said, those derived from machine learning and AI, is really going to help semioticians and semiotics expand their ability to do analysis. And part of this is to do with the fact that software will enable a more objective, larger scale analysis of data. And we'll get into that a bit later on. First of all, some background is in terms of where my personal approach to semiotics come from. Via a very convoluted path, I became interested in this person called Charles Sanders Peirce. Peirce was probably the least well-known but most important American philosopher for the past couple of hundred years. Most people don't know who he is. He formulated a branch of semiotics that has a very different approach than the traditional, more British continental approach, which was pioneered by Ferdinand de Saussure. De Saussure was a linguist primarily, who then came along and developed a semiotic framework. Peirce had a very diverse intellectual background. I think he finally wound up as a cartographer for the American government. There's quite a good biography of him published in 1988 by Joseph Brent. Brent describes him as a wasp in a bottle, and he was quite a contentious figure, and over the years basically managed to annoy most people around him, and really in the end was hanging on, living a life in real penury. He really didn't have any money. Interestingly, one of his pupils was somebody called William James. Now, William James is quite famous in psychology for his book, The Principles of Psychology, in 1980, which is widely regarded as the beginning of the American-British empirical school of psychology, which still dominates today. James had been a pupil of Peirce's, and indeed a lot of Peirce's philosophy was used by James in his Principles of Psychology. And in fact, when Peirce was old, James supported him as he was much more successful and essentially stopped him from starving. If you want a more recent book about semiotics, and in particular visual semiotics, this book by Tony Jappi, I think that's how you pronounce his name, is quite interesting. Anybody who wants to form a study group with me to go through this, I would really appreciate the help. But it is quite a good book and quite interesting for a more up-to-date perspective on semiotics. Just to describe what we're talking about, we see semiotics as the art and science of signs. The word art there is important because very often when I hear the interpretation or report of a semiotician, I'm incredibly impressed with how they can weave together such a great story. It's, to our mind, the knowledge structures of text and imagery. This talk is going to bias towards images, but of course you can apply the same techniques towards text. The example we have here is an image that is meant to sort of embody tranquility. It's leaves, stone and water. And you can imagine that certain configuration of leaves, stone and water wouldn't embody or signify tranquility. Here, this arrangement is generally seen as signifying tranquility. Now, quantitative semiotics tries to use techniques derived from machine learning, and machine learning is really, if you like, iterative statistics, to analyze images, to analyze text, and provide some sort of quantification of the signifiers or the sign structure within that image or text. That's what we're trying to do, and that's what we're going to talk about today in terms of mainly how it can help with images but also with text. This gives you an example of the information that we extract from images and text and use this as the basis for our analysis. There's the content, that is the objects that are within the image. There's the color composition. The semiotics of color, I think, is relatively understudied, if you like, and something that we're increasingly seeing as important the more data we analyze over time. We can look at the complexity and the composition of an image. The example here is, as you can see, the image on the bottom there of the pink ice cream. We probably all agree that that's not a very rich image, it's not a very complex image, whereas the image on the top of all the different fruits is quite complex, and we give it a level of richness that would be quite high, and there we've given them numeric values. We also have what we call semiotic and emotional energies, for example, hedonism and nurture. And we'll talk a bit later about these Jungian archetypes, as we call them, that have become quite popular. We call them archetypes, archetype structures. And here we see an example of how an image of a man on top of a mountain scores, if you see there, quite highly as an explorer. And this is we found quite an important technique in analysing images and text. In 2001, a book came out by Mark and Pearson, which popularised the use of Jungian archetypes in brand management. No doubt you have heard of this book, or you will have seen the results of this analysis, where people talk about a particular brand or an advertisement showing, as I said before, an explorer archetype, or joker, or rebel, or ruler, or sage, or caregiver. For instance, pictures of kittens would do that. Kittens and babies, and kittens are very close to babies in the internet's world. And this really was quite a revolution, I think, and it was an attempt, which is people still use a lot, to have these general sets of signifiers, rebel, joker, lover, caregiver, and apply them to brands or to advertisements, so you could categorize them and say, well, you know, this is more of an explorer archetype in here as opposed to more of a caregiver archetype over there. To change tack a little, and this is really the core of our argument here, as we all know, the internet is exploding in terms of imagery and text and simply everything. Websites, commentary, blogs, the whole thing. We don't have to go through this again. But as an illustration, if we look at the total number of daily active Instagram users, recent numbers say 1.9 billion. Instagram stories per day, 500 million. This is a vast amount of information. Number of businesses on the Instagram, 200 million plus. It's almost de rigueur to have an Instagram account these days as a business. And it's become a very important platform for both marketing and market research. The issue for researchers, and particularly for semioticians, is, I would say, the scale of this platform, and indeed the scale of the internet. Thousands and thousands and thousands of images. For instance, we typically analyze anywhere between 10 to 20,000 images for a project. If, as a person, you spent 5 seconds looking at each image, you would spend about 27 hours just going through the images and looking at each image once. This makes it extremely difficult to do any sort of analysis in any sort of reasonable timescale. And in fact, I'd argue that it's pretty difficult to absorb more than a few hundred images as an individual and manage to extract consistent information out of them. Yet this is the scale of the problem that researchers and semioticians, I believe, are facing now. And it's a hindrance for anyone wanting to use Instagram as a source of information. The problem you've got is analysing images. There are lots and lots of images. We typically do analysis related to influencers. And you might have many influencers and you want to do an analysis of their general archetypes. If we go back to the Jungian archetypes that we were showing you there, it's a lot of information, and you need to do this in a time scale of under a month. People want the data within 10 days. Yet if you're trying to analyse 20,000 images, which may be from 5 different influencers, it's extremely difficult. And this goes back to the core thesis. Semiotics tend to be a practitioner-based discipline, at least in the past. Individuals, extremely skilled individuals, very impressive individuals, produced analyses of advertisements, of whatever information the client had. Might be websites, might be text, but that was something that they did as an individual without any help. And inherently, a person can only absorb so much information, and as we're saying, this leads to scaling problems. Humans can only consistently analyse a limited amount of information, yet we are constantly bombarded as researchers by a vast avalanche of information. Automated analysis, quantitative semiotics, is not a total solution to this problem, but it's a start, it's a tool. It allows an analyst, a semiotician, to condense information and therefore analyse more information and give a better, more rounded picture of the question and the solution. We need new approaches. And as I said previously, this technique, quantitative semiotics, is simply a tool for semioticians that they can leverage to enable them to analyse more data, which in the end is what they're going to be called on to do. An example we've got here is our soft drinks project, where we analysed Instagram posts. There were about 12,000 from 20 brands of soft drinks. Everything from Coca-Cola to real kombucha to Tropicana juices, Iron Brew, few Scots out there, Evian came down as a soft drink, Tango, that kind of thing. The examples we'll show here were taken from an analysis of images that were posted on the Instagram accounts of these drinks. So here we see the application of automated archetype analysis using Jungian archetypes in the first instance here, of a picture of Innocent, taken from the Innocent Instagram account, a picture taken from, I believe, Karma Drinks here in the middle from their Instagram account, and a picture taken from Lucozade Sport, a big, pretty well-known brand. What we have on the left is a plot which we call a spider plot because it looks like a spider's web, and there it gives the numeric values of how we find these images score on these elements of the Jungian archetype. So if you look at innocent, which is the red line at the top there, and the image on the top on the right, it scores quite highly on the caregiver archetype. I'm going to put that down to the fact that it's got nice fluffy bobbly hats on the drinks. That's my interpretation of that. If we look at Lucozade Sport on the bottom of the very dynamic looking woman, it scores more highly on the hero archetype, and I think we can probably see how that comes across. This is a person who's looking strong and fit, in control, very heroic Lucozade drinker. Innocent Karma drink, sorry, in the middle there, the blue line. Well, it's a mixed picture, bit of rebellion, bit of Joker, not as clear as the other two. It's less obvious what kind of imagery they're trying to promote within these pictures. So that's an example of archetype analysis, which is one of really the core of our technique of quantitative semiotics as we see. We don't see that we're doing everything that quantitative semiotics can do, and at the end I'll mention another initiative that we're starting, but it's something. It enables the analysis of tens of thousands of images and gives you some analysis of them in a way that can then be applied easily across other images, across a wide range of information. One of the other sets of archetypes that we have are the Schwartz archetypes of cross-cultural values, which I'm sure many of you have heard of. This is a slightly different way of approaching it. The Jungian archetypes have some issues, one of them being that it tends to anthropomorphize a brand or an image, saying it's like a hero, it's like a Joker. We're really giving them personalities. That's not always a good way of looking at a particular brand or an image. Schwartz's values were designed as the values that individuals would have in terms of how they viewed the world. And a lot of research has shown, and this particularly comes down to something called transactional analysis, is that how you see the world controls how you react to it. Your perception of the world is very much a driver of your behavior towards the world. And in Schwartz's taxonomy, if you like, there's universalism, fairness, understanding, tolerance, protection, all the way down to self-direction, independent thought, action, choosing. Now, if you look at these and you look at some of the Jungian archetypes, you can see where there's some overlap in terms of what these constructs are, but they are by no means the same. And this illustrates the fact that using archetype analysis, you can adapt existing systems of analysis, and here we have, individuals' worldview, and use them to analyze imagery or text. And we also are able to, and have started to develop, archetype structures that are very much tuned to a company's or a brand's perception of the world that brand may live in, and they are, very customizable. So here, and we've got Coca-Cola here, apparently scores very highly or relatively highly on the self-directedness dimension. Innocent, more towards benevolence, and as we saw with that image, they had little fluffy hats on, so we can perhaps see where that came from. Lucozade Sport, biasing a bit more towards achievement and hedonism than the other two brands there. So that gives you an example of how the brands can differ, or the images I should say, in terms of what they're trying to transmit through the images, can differ across these archetypes. And this is rather complicated representation of some other constructs we have that we call universal energies. There's rather a lot of them, but again, it's a way of breaking down the imagery or the text in terms of the constructs that it embodies and what it might be signifying and trying to transmit towards the consumer. At the end of this, what we wind up being able to do is we can consistently, or as consistently as we can, categorize images or text. We can do this because we have metrics, we have measurements of the image on these archetypes that we can then use using various statistical techniques to categorize an image or a piece of text. This gives an example, and the colored dots, where they're the same color, they're meant to be the same, what we term cluster, the same category. And this is how we would categorize various images that are from the Instagram accounts, as we've been talking about. And so here we've managed, using these scores on the archetypes, we can then categorize images as belonging, or pieces of text, I should point out as well, as belonging to a certain category. Once we've got these clusters or categories, we can give them names, ease of use, that embody what we think is contained within that category. And remember, these categories are all based on measurements based on the characteristics of the image, of the archetypes, and of the composition of the image. We term these semiotic clusters. Now, many metrics, and this is an example of the different sorts of metrics that we've got, many metrics can determine the property of these clusters. But they are, in general, we find distinct. Sometimes it's very easy to see why certain images or pieces of text can be put together. I mean, in this illustration here, we've got pretty much some pictures of fruit in a relatively simple way. I think that the term for this is nulling, where you take a picture of something just as a representation of it. And these are the plots showing the different characteristics of these categories. If we go back to our two brands here, Innocent and Coca-Cola, what you can see on the bottom is, given all these different images, where they appear in terms of the different categories. So let's look at Coca-Cola. Coca-Cola has a relatively consistent set of imagery. The images tend to be the same color. They're very much into their color red. And they will tend to be in the same clusters, which we see here down the bottom, on the bottom left. I think it's positivity and simplicity. If you look at Innocent, Innocent has a much more diverse set of images. They are therefore spread more across the clusters. Now, this could be a good or a bad thing. One thing about Coca-Cola is that it's very consistent in the message that it's transmitting. You could say that Innocent is trying to transmit a more complex image across its postings on Instagram. Whether or not this is a good thing is debatable, but it comes out very clearly from the analysis that Coca-Cola has the simple, more consistent imagery, and Innocent is much more complicated. Therefore, the implication of this technique is that automated semiotic analysis allows the semiotic analysis of much larger data sets than human practitioners can manage. Many thousands. We typically do 10 to 20,000 images. More could be done. We can analyze hundreds of thousands of pieces of text. We feel that this technique, although it's really a relatively small, if you like, sliver of the universe of semiotic analysis, it can be used to expand the use of semiotic analysis. It's something that can be used to analyze data that is in the world now, that is very much available, that companies really want to have analyzed, but you can use semiotic analysis to do this. We think that it can position semiotics as a core technique within a project. Very often, and it's true that this is really oriented towards projects that have a very quantitative emphasis. Semiotic analysis is something that's tacked on the end. It's sort of like, well, and yes, we can do some semiotic analysis of the Instagram posts. It will cost you X, Y, Z. But very often, that's the first thing that goes when cost cutting comes into play, as is inevitable with so many projects. With this technique, semiotic analysis now becomes the core analysis technique of the project. We also think that using this kind of approach, it can be used on a wider class of data. For instance, semiotic analysis of websites. Many thousands of websites can be analysed as opposed to a few hundred by a practitioner. Semiotic analysis of sales and marketing terms in terms of the scale. Of course, that goes on constantly, but we're talking here about the scale. You can analyse Instagram. You can analyse, if you must, Twitter in semiotic terms, but look at many tens of thousands of pieces of information rather than at most maybe 1,000. We talk about cultural weather analysis. That's looking at internal, external communications of a company or a brand. And general culture analysis of the media world. We've done a little bit of that. What we'd like to do is to expand the quantitative semiotic toolkit, and one thing that we're really looking at the moment is to see if there's any way of doing some form of automated semiotic square analysis. You'll all be very familiar with this, I'm sure. It's a very classic form of semiotic analysis. We think we can help semioticians, and I must put the emphasis on the word help semioticians apply the semiotic square to very large data sets, which previously simply wouldn't be possible. So, thanks for listening. Please give me your questions and comments. And really, we're very excited by this technique because we really think we can help spread the word about semiotic analysis, which we feel is a really important technique, and hopefully we can position it as a core analytic method going forward. Thanks very much for your time.